So now I'm going to show you the process that I go through when I take one of my images from a sketch in my sketchbook to a design that is transferable to a block, and then how I then decide to carve this as a one colour A6 print. So I'm going to keep this, I'm going to try and just go a bit more in depth into my process about how I go from start to finish with this. So hopefully this is something you can either follow yourself with this image if you really want to, or something that you can use and apply to your own images too. So in one of my little A6 sketchbooks, I've already got this drawing of a bird that I made before. I tried to keep this one really simple, just in one colour, because I just want to use one block for my print. And if I wanted to include more colours, I would have to do a slightly more complex process of using multiple blocks to print with, or by using a reduction Lino process, which isn't something I'm going to be talking about too much today. I just want to focus on shapes and mark making with single block printing. I think this is a really good stepping stone to start with if you're a beginner, or something just to play around with if you've been doing this a lot. It's quite good to restrict yourself in your colour palette so you work more effectively when you are changing something to a specific process that already has boundaries and restrictions. So, to start with, I want to take this drawing and apply it to my A6 block. Some of the main obstacles you're going to cross with this is if you tried to draw this completely accurately back onto your block, it's going to take you quite a while. You already spent a lot of time on your drawing, you don't want to spend too much time scribbling it onto a block. You're also going to be faced with this mirroring that I talked about before, where all text, etc. is reversed when it's printed. So I'd have to draw this backwards onto my block if I wanted it to then be printed back in the same way that it is here. So there's a really, really simple method to follow this. There's different ways of doing this, but I always find that using tracing paper is the most favourite method for me. It's really easy just to get hold of anything like this. You could just use plain paper, but tracing paper works much better for transferring. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to trace my design using that soft pencil, like a 2B to a 6B. I'm going to trace all of the outlines and a few of the marks that I want, and then flip the tracing paper onto my block and rub onto it so that the graphite takes to my block, and I've got an exact replica of my drawing on here, ready to be carved. It's a very, very simple process, but it works incredibly well. So I'm just going to pop a little bit of masking tape on here too, just to hold my tracing paper in place. So taking my pencil, just going to trace around the whole image. Just like this. Just keep working around each of the bits. Just be careful because this lead can smudge, or the graphite can smudge quite easily. I'm going kind of loose with this because I like my designs to still have, to not tighten up too much in the final process. I find redrawing things a few times can make things a little bit tight and less playful. With my work, I like to keep it as loose as possible, so I'm not too strict with how much I follow these lines, but I do like to get this main figure that I have here. Right, I'll just skip to the end of this one for you. Great, so I've just finished tracing the outline of my design with my soft pencil onto some tracing paper. Just missed a small bit of the beak there. I'll just add that on here. Now, I'm just going to remove these bits of masking tape too. original drawing to the side and get my block ready. I'm going to be transferring onto the green side of this Japanese vinyl. It doesn't matter if I did it on the green or the blue. And I'm going to turn my design upside down so that the graphite is facing the block. That way I can transfer all the graphite by rubbing directly onto it. I'm just going to reuse that masking tape on my block to hinge it on so that when I'm rubbing the design, that does not shuffle around anywhere. There's some people just use a dull-edged object to rub around their design. I quite like using the pencil that I just drew with to scribble along, because that way I can see exactly where I've been. But as long as you're applying some pressure, you can work your way around the design. And get all of that image transferred onto there. Let's just scribble all of that on there. It's important to always make sure you have the graphite side down, otherwise you're going to destroy your image, which is not good if you've spent lots of time working on that. Nobody wants that. Alright, let's just have a quick peek. You might not be able to see that too clearly yet, but I have got some of the design transferred here. I'm just going to skip to the end, where I continue to doing this until the entire design is on the block. Okay, so I've just transferred the design onto my block. Just finished scribbling all over the back of this tracing paper. Now I'm just going to peel this back. And I've now transferred a very light shading of graphite all the way across this block. So I've now got my image in reverse, which means it will then go back to the original way that it looked in my sketchbook when it's printed. So this works the same way with text. If you wanted to do a large block of text, I'd recommend transferring it with tracing paper so you don't have to learn to redraw text backwards, which probably take you quite a little while. But if you're up for the challenge, maybe take that for a spin, but I wouldn't recommend it. So at this point, you can start carving into your block if you really want to get going, but because this is a really soft graphite, it will smudge and rub off as you work really, really easily. So if you're working and you're like me, you're a lefty and you're a bit heavy-handed, I'd smudge off half my design before I'm even finished and I wouldn't know where I'm working. So this is where our permanent marker pen comes in handy. Using this, I can then redraw the image permanently onto the block using this pen. So I'm just going to trace the lines on here, and that is just going to fix everything in place. You can take your time and do something much neater than me, but I don't mind having a bit of loose playfulness in my work. It's a bit wobbly. I don't really have that much of a steady hand anyway, so heck, if I can do it, I'm sure you can do a fantastic job. Please excuse all the traffic and alarms and stuff. I'm right next to a busy road, and it's the only place that had decent lighting to get this done. Right, so hopefully this gives you an idea of how I fix my design onto my image. I'm just going to keep doing this. I'm just going to cut straight to the end. I'm just going to keep going and finish this one off and then show you the rest in a moment. Great. So I've now just finished drawing all of my design with a marker pen. This is now nicely fixed on here. It's not going to rub off anywhere. It means that I can just get stuck in with cutting my block. So I'm just going to remove this little bit of tracing paper. Don't need that anymore. Now I'm ready to start cutting. So at this point, when I'm ready to start cutting, the first step that I take is I take my V tool and I use my V tool to cut around any objects that I want to separate away from the background that I'm removing. So for this design, what I want to do is keep most of the areas of the bird and the leaves and the branches raised and remove all of this background around the rest of the image. So removing the background is much easier when you use a U tool because it has a much wider gouge. And if I was just to go straight in and scoop with this, I'd probably get quite rough edges around my design. And I want to keep this slightly neat around each of the shapes. So what I'm going to do is go around every single black line with my V tool and cut a line out so that it separates the block that I'm keeping raised from the block that's going to be removed. I'm just going to top up that little foot there that I thought to remove. And we're good to go. So, holding that tool along your index finger and in the palm of your hand, just give it a nice firm grip. Remember to always cut away from yourself. I'm just going to go straight in, cut along the line, slowly turning the block as I go along. So to hold a continuous line, you don't want to keep digging in deeper. This takes a little bit of practice. Just want to keep gently just pushing away from yourself while holding that sort of 35 degree angle. Whenever you're cutting a line and you get to the end of a angle that you were taking, if there's quite a sharp turn in the edge, you can stop and you might end up having a flappy bit of lino like this. These bits you can just pick off if you wanted, and that should just leave you with a little sharp edge there to keep working. Or you could just stop, leave the flap there, and work back in from a different angle and come and join where you finished with your last line. So this is going to give me a really neat edge on the outline of my image. Just going to keep scooping. I'm not trying to dig too heavily. Just going to stop here. So I've just dug all the way around this part of the image. Still got a nice flap here. I'm going to carry this line all the way and up along the wing. And I'm just going to gently scoop so that I've got a varied width of line that just tapers off at the end into a nice straight line. Now let me just take a little rubbing of what I've done so far so you can see a bit clearer. So far the part of the bird that I've got starting around where the beak is, following around the head, then I've just changed my angle. You can see I've got a nice sharp edge there, and it tapers off to the wing here, where I've got this nice fine edge here. And I'm just going to keep following this line around. Great. So now I'm just going to keep following the line around the rest of my image. So where this tapered off into a shorter line here, I'm just going to start again further down the line. Just another scoop, very gently turning that block around. Coming into a final line there. just rejoining that line here. So I'm going to keep sort of isolating the bird from the background, which will just take me a moment. You can see I've got a nice scooping movement I'm doing at the end of some of my lines that give me that nice, sharp, pointed edge. Whenever I'm coming back to a part that I don't want to have removed, so it's coming to the end of this line, I was coming towards my wing, which is a key part that I want to keep raised. I'm just slowing the tool down, slow it right down and just very gently go towards the end. Don't force or go deeper at this point, because if I'd have skipped out of the end of the line, I would have taken a big chunk out of my block. Something like that you can't take back, but you can work into part of the design. So if you have any accidents as you're going along, especially if this is your first attempt, any mistakes like that happen where you cut in the wrong place or remove an incorrect part of the block, just work with it. Try and turn it into a bit of mark making or shading. You'd be surprised how many of these things, happy accidents, look really good at the end. Printmaking can be a bit spontaneous like that, and it's good to kind of work with things as they develop. I'm just tidying up that corner there and a few bits that got stuck. So I'm just digging back in gently with my V tool. Coming to an end. It's quite a sharp end, so I'm going to stop there, leave the flat and work my way back there onto the tip. So hopefully you can see a shine on the block where I've cut in various ways. And let me just take a rubbing of that just to show you how my line work is going. So we're just gonna rub over this design. My 6B went blunt, so I'm just using a stick of graphite that I could just pull up from beside my desk. Great. So hopefully now you can see much clearer how my image is starting to develop. I'm drawing this line around where I want to go. Some people might just want to draw a line on a solid raised block and just have line work for their image. There's nothing wrong with that. There is no right or wrong method of working with this as such, as long as you're just planning ahead and you kind of know where you want to go with things. I know that I want to remove the background eventually for this. That's what I'm working towards by going around each of my shapes to separate them from the areas that I'm going to remove, so I can keep these clean lines at the end of my finished piece. So I'm just going to time-lapse the next bit, just whiz right through me cutting around each of the shapes. This is something that I think you should practice yourself quite a lot, just to get more confident with your lines. I think this is something you can just keep working through until you feel more confident with it. Right, now let's get going with this. So now that I've finished cutting the outlines around where I'd drawn the black line earlier to separate the objects I want raised from the background that I'm going to remove, I've now ended up with a block that looks like this. So I've just finished taking a rubbing of this, so to give you a clearer idea of where I've cut, you can see I now have leaf shapes and the line of my bird. I've done some quite rough cuts around them, so a lot of the background that's going to be removed does look a bit scraggly, but these bits are going to be removed, so I haven't been too gentle with them. So everything's looking pretty good right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch from using my V tool to using a U-shaped gouge tool. And I'm going to start removing the background. And then once I've removed the background, I'm going to start deciding how I'm going to add different marks. I'm going to keep working along like I have here to remove some of the background. So with my U tool, I'm going to start cutting from the outside of my shape along the lines that I cut earlier with the V tool, and using this U tool I'll cut to the outside of my block. So I'm just going to do some scoops just along here. So I'm just working in a scooping motion because I'm removing it. It doesn't matter if it's a little bit rough. Sometimes when you're scooping there can be extra raised bits that get left behind. You can always keep returning to your block to cut more at the end. So if something in the background is still there and you want to remove it, you can get rid of it at a later time, but you can't add back to your background if you remove something. So take your time with this. I'd always suggest cutting away from your image. You can see I'm working to the outside of the block, but say if I was to cut from here all the way back to the line here, I could easily skip at the end and my tool could jump and I could cut a chunk out of this bird's tail, for example. That's not something that I want to happen, so I'm just going to keep working really gently to the outside. You can also use another technique of going along with your U tool and going around the image. In the same direction that you went with the V tool. So just following this line along here. This is a really good method for when you get, that was a really close one, when you get up to these more complicated areas up here, you may want to start following the edges of your lines rather than working towards the edge, because there's a bit too many obstructions there. So I'm just going to time lapse this next bit, just speed it up, and I'm just going to whiz through cutting the rest of the background for this block. Okay, so now I've finished clearing my background out a nice bit, and I've just taken a rubbing as well. So my image is starting to take a little bit more shape. See, I've cleared out a lot of the background, and there's a lot of marks from where I've done quite a rough cut on my lino when I'm clearing the background. So you can see it's lots of lines being picked up here. The majority of these lines won't show up on your final print. When you do a rubbing, it tends to pick up more of the background than the actual print will pick up. So I'm just going to work with this for now and not bother doing anything about it until the printing stage. What I am going to do is I'm going to start adding some more mark making into my image. My bird is still looking like one solid shape, and I really want to differentiate the chest of the bird, bring out the eyes, the beak a bit more, and make the tail a bit more decorative. I'm also going to work some patterns into the leaves as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my V-shape tool, and I'm just going to work back in, add some stems, and I'm just going to do some gentle, small dashes, I guess you could call them, along the wings, and then I'm also going to do a crosshatch design along the chest. So I'm just going to time-lapse this again as well, because I think this is something you can just do and play around yourself using different shapes and almost work up a palette of different marks. Okay, well, I've finished carving my block, so I've removed as much of the background as I'm satisfied with, and I've added loads more detail into the bird just to give it so much more character, and the depth of line that you use in a lino print can really help just bring out the process in all its glory. This isn't the kind of process where you can do lots of shading and tone, but through lots of mark making you can help separate out a lot of your shapes that you're using that create your image, and add a lot more depth into different backgrounds if you are doing something that's a landscape. So just to give you a bit more of an idea of how my image looks now, I've just taken a rubbing of the final thing, so you can see my bird's now got a much more defined beak, which is just an outline. So I've done this just by leaving a raised area around the edge of the beak, removing the inside, and just leaving the line where his beak is. A little bit of a, I say a chubby cheek, but it's a beak. Birds don't really have cheeks, but this one does. Just define the eye a bit more. Added some really fine marking around there. I've kept the tail and the wing quite bulky, but I've just used varied widths of lines just to help separate those two, just to give them much more movement. And I've added this cross-hatching squares to the chest, just to give it a bit more of a decorative touch. Even just by adding in a lot of these details around the leaves, it's really helped bring everything out. So I'd always recommend just working into your block. Some people like doing things really chunky and just leaving it maybe at this stage, but I think by showing all of these off now, you can get a really good idea of how things have moved from this very simple cut that I've got at the beginning, to building up my line work, to separate the shapes, dealing with the background or the inside of your shapes if you're not removing the background. And then finally, bringing it all to life with these details. It's really good to take rubbings as you go along just to mark your progress, see where you went right, maybe where you went wrong, but you can help deal with that further down the line. And this is much cleaner than having to ink up your block and print every time that you do this. So I'm pretty satisfied with this. So I'm going to leave it on the cutting side of things, clean some of this up, and I'm going to start taking a few proof prints of this. So the next part of this video, I'm just going to keep showing you how to progress with this. You can do a little bit more cutting in as you keep printing, but this is mostly going to be about how to roll out ink correctly, apply it to your block, and transfer a clean print to your paper